In Chapter 8, we're going to cover the muscular system. Let's look at some functions of the muscular system. Muscles enable movement. Muscles, however, must be stimulated by a nerve impulse in order to contract. Types of movement include running, contraction of the diaphragm, responsible for breathing, and regulation of blood flow. Muscles generate a lot of heat. That is by their metabolic activity. This is quite obvious if you start to exercise. You can feel your body warming up. This heat, if it is distributed by the circulatory system, helps to keep all your other organs warm. Muscles help maintain posture and provide joint support. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. All movements require muscles, and muscles are organs because they consist of several different types of tissues that function together, and muscles all require chemical energy to contract. The 3 types of muscle tissue found in the human body are skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. If you go to your APR program, the module under the muscular system, and view the animation, there's a really nice overview on muscle tissue. Let's look at the structure of muscle tissue, and we're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue. We'll go over a little bit on cardiac, and then we'll look at the differences between smooth and skeletal muscle. Remember, each muscle is an organ. It has the muscle tissue that's involved, that's the bulk of the muscle. There's nervous tissue, because remember, nerve impulses are required for contraction. There's blood vessels that flow through the muscles, and there's other connective tissues that form kind of coverings or wrappings around the muscle. So again, like I said, we're going to focus on the structure of a skeletal muscle. So let's start at the very bottom. Let's start with the endomysium. The endomysium covers each muscle cell. And another way of saying muscle cell is a muscle fiber. I don't know, I always think of it as maybe like a hot dog or a pickle. Okay, it has a covering around it. And then bundles of these fibers are collected together, and this is called a fascicle. And the fascicle is covered with the perimysium. So you had a bunch of pickles. This is going to get weird. Okay, you had a pickle wrapped in saran wrap, and then you took a bunch of these individual pickles that were wrapped in saran wrap and wrapped more saran wrap around the entire outside. And then you took a bunch of these fascicles together, and then the epimysium is the layer of connective tissue around the whole muscle. And the epimysium is continuous with tendons and ligaments. So if you look at this diagram, you can see all the individual type of packaging that's involved, right? Which you have surrounding the individual muscle fiber. Muscle fibers are grouped together in fascicles. Group of fascicles are combined together to form the entire muscle. Fascia is a connective tissue that binds muscles together, helps to enclose them and separate muscles, particularly muscles that are overlapping each other. Tendons bind muscle to bone. Here's an example of fascia, plantar fascia, right, that helps to separate the muscles within the tendons of the bone. Some people get inflammation in this area, and it's called plantar fasciitis, inflammation of the fascia. And aponeurosis is a fan-shaped tendon that may attach muscles to muscles or muscles to bones. Right? Superficial to the rectus abdominis is an aponeurosis in the abdominal area. Let's look at the structure of a skeletal muscle fiber. Remember, each skeletal muscle fiber is a muscle cell. Each muscle cell is the entire length of the muscle, very long, and they're cylindrical, like a spaghetti. Muscle fibers are specialized because they must receive a nerve impulse in order to contract. And so there's some specialized names that are given to these structures. So the cell membrane is called a sarcolemma, and what's normally beneath the cell membrane of the cell, called the cytoplasm, is called the sarcoplasm. And the sarcoplasm is unique that it contains many mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. This is a structure in the cell that generates ATP. ATP is a type of chemical energy. And skeletal muscle fibers are multinucleated because as you're growing and your muscles are getting longer, the cells need to replicate. But instead of forming, 2, 4, 8, 16 individual cells, they remain connected together. So you get very long, cylindrical, multinucleated cells that contain many mitochondria. The individual unit of contraction is called a sarcomere. So you can see this kind of word root of sarco is used very often in discussing skeletal muscle fibers. The cells are packed with protein fibers, and it's the overlapping of the protein fibers that enables contraction to occur. There are two types of myofilaments. These are protein filaments. There's the thin filament, which is called actin. I remember tin sounds like thin. And the thick filament, which is called myosin. And it's the arrangement of these filaments that produces striations or striped-like appearance. This banding pattern or striations is due to the overlap of the thick and thin filament. And we're not going to go into all the structures shown here, but from Z line to Z line is one sarcomere. So you can say you start off with just thin filaments. They're kind of in the maroonish color. And then there's an area of overlap where you have thick and thin. And then you have in the middle, like where the M line is. Again, don't worry about that term. You have only thick filaments. Then you have an area of overlap again. And then area just thin filaments. So sliding filaments is what results in contraction. The thin filaments move in toward the thick. So you can see the sarcomere at rest, you have that opened area in the middle where you only have thick filaments. But when the sarcomere contracts, like on the right, you can see the thin filaments have been pulled in toward the middle. The thick filaments are going to pull on the thin filaments. And so their sarcomeres are lined up one after another. Each individual sarcomere is going to contract, and that enables a contraction of the entire muscle. This contraction requires ATP, chemical energy that's manufactured by the mitochondria. So as the thin filaments slide past the thick, the sarcomere shortens. And the muscles can continue to contract as long as ATP is present, there's enough energy, and calcium is present. Now, we're not going to go into all the detail about all the regulatory mechanism, but just very briefly, a nerve impulse, right, is transmitted to the sarcolemma, the cell membrane of skeletal muscle. It's going to find its way down toward the center of the skeletal muscle, and then it's going to cause the release of calcium. And when calcium is released, so the nerve impulse causes the release of calcium, that's going to allow the thick filaments to start to pull on the thin filaments, right? One contraction, one pulling. The calcium goes back, right? The sarcomere relaxes. So in order for a muscle to contract, it has to be continually stimulated. So as long as it's relieving stimuli, calcium remains available and contraction occurs. Sarcomeres get shorter, 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 more force is built up. So here we see in the middle, you have our thick filaments, right? And you can see the thin filaments, and see the purple thing that kind of looks like a piece of spaghetti, right? And the actin, or the little round circles that kind of look like olives, everything's food to me, right? When calcium is released, there's a little shift, and the little purple part, right, on the actin filament is exposed, and that's the binding site. And then it allows these little heads that are sticking up from the myosin to attach to the binding site and contract, right? When calcium is not present, it goes back to this kind of off position, right, where a contraction will not occur. So you want to be able to regulate when contraction occurs, when contraction doesn't occur. Next, let's look at the neuromuscular junction. So just like the name indicates, this is where you have a junction between a neuron and the muscle. Motor neurons are the type of neurons that are attached to skeletal muscles. They are located in the brain or the spinal cord, and they send the impulse. Right? The impulse is going to travel down to the end of the neuron until it reaches the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter involved in skeletal muscle contractions, or ACH. So when the impulse reaches the end of the neuron, it causes the release of the neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter decreases across the synaptic cleft. That's just a little space, a little gap between the neuron and the cell and the muscle cell membrane. If you want to learn more about the neuromuscular junction, you can view the crash course video. We're also going to study the neuromuscular junction when we do the nervous system. Okay, the signal sent down the motor neuron causes the release of acetylcholine that diffuses across the synaptic cleft. This interacts with receptors on the sarcoplasm of the skeletal muscle fiber and causes a reaction, kind of a cascaded signal, to reach the cell's interior. And this causes the release of calcium ions. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just like a little storage container, right? This is going to enable myosin to bind to actin and cause the sarcomere to contract. When sarcomeres contract, the entire muscle shortens. The contraction is going to stop when the impulse from the neuron stops, right? Calcium is going to go back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the myosin is going to let go of the actin, and the muscle is going to relax. So again, really intending to not make this overly complicated. Number one, this is the muscle relaxed. The actin is in its inactive site, and we're not going to worry about tropomyosin, troponin. All those are kind of regulatory proteins, but the actin does not have its binding sites exposed, right? So if you go down to number two, calcium is released. That interacts with the actin. The actin now has its binding sites exposed. The myosin head can attach. This is number three. Forms what's known as a cross bridge. Then generates a power stroke. Pulls all the actin, that kind of sounded weird, in towards the center. In order to recock the myosin heads, energy is needed, right? So you have ATP being utilized. So it's broken down, it forms ATP and P. Okay, so adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate plus phosphate. Can now attach again. So it's going to keep power stroking, and these are all moving at different times, all the heads, right? It's going to pull it, contracting, generating more force, right, until nerve stimuli stops. And that causes the muscle to relax. As calcium will be transported back in a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So a muscle just can't contract once, right? Just can't have one nerve stimuli sent, myosin attached to actin, one power stroke done, right? So you generally need to be able to generate more tension than that. And so there's kind of two ways you can generate tension. So in unfused tetanus, the muscle fiber is not allowed to relax completely between stimuli. The fiber is stimulated about 50 times a second. If you want to generate maximum tension more quickly, the stimuli is sent between 80 and 100 times per second. So you get a sustained contraction with maximum tension. Obviously, you don't want to do that all the time. If you were to pick up a styrofoam cup of coffee, you don't want your fingers generating maximum tension because you end up crushing the cup. So this is just kind of two ways you can balance how much tension is being generated and how long the contraction is being sustained. So maximum tension can occur in fused tetanus. The end of the motor neurons are branched, So each motor neuron innervates more than one muscle fiber. This is referred to as a motor unit. This slide shows you an actual neuromuscular junction. You can see the axon or the end of the motor nerve, and the motor end plate is where it's interacting with the skeletal muscle fiber. Some motor units may be very large. You may have one motor neuron innervating thousands of muscle cells. So each nerve stimuli is going to reach thousands of muscle cells at one time. This can generate a lot of power, but not necessarily precision. An example of a muscle where you would have large motor units would be your quadriceps. Your quadriceps femoris group of muscles. If you have small motor units, this doesn't generate a lot of force, but generates more precision. You would have small motor units located in your fingers. When a nerve impulse is sent by a motor neuron, all cells in the motor unit will contract. In order to regulate the amount of contraction or force of the contraction, this is done by regulating the number of motor units that are engaged, or called recruitment. So you can see, if you want a lot of precision, you don't want to have a large number of muscle cells in one motor unit. You want to have very few muscle cells in each motor unit, and then you can always recruit or add more motor units on as needed. Rigor mortis. When someone dies, the regulation of calcium ions stops. Calcium ions leak into the cell. This causes the muscle fibers to contract. When the cell is depleted of energy, ATP, the myosin cannot detach from the actin. This causes rigor mortis, or stiffness of death. Rigor mortis continues until protein degradation begins. The time of rigor mortis is affected by temperature and humidity. Alright, I will post a link to 10 bodily functions that keep working after death, which is kind of interesting. However, the video just keeps getting pulled down for content. Hey, it's anatomy. It's really not that creepy. But we'll see if you get a chance to watch it. Or you could Google it on your own, because when I post a link, it'll get pulled down, but it'll get reposted. Someone will repost this. Skeletal muscles have two ends. One end's the origin, the other's the insertion. The origin is the end that remains stationary. The origin is usually attached to a bone. The insertion is the part of the muscle that moves during contraction. As the muscle gets shorter, the insertion is moved toward the origin. Skeletal muscle contraction involves the shortening of sarcomeres and the pulling of muscles against its attachments. Remember that once a motor unit is stimulated, all cells within the motor unit contract fully. There's no partial contraction of a cell. When more power or force is generated, motor units can be recruited. Motor units can also alternate to allow part of the muscle to rest. Muscle tone. When you hear the term muscle tone, you tend to think about the appearance of someone's muscles who exercises a lot. But anatomically, muscle tone is continuous state of sustained contraction of motor units in your postural muscles. These are muscles that allow you to sit up or stand up straight. Remember that skeletal muscle contraction is voluntary. So if you were sitting in a chair and all of a sudden you became unconscious, you would fall over. These sustained contractions also are important in postural stability. Postural stability keeps segments of the body steady even when other body parts are moving. An example of this is keeping your trunk erect and steady when your arms are moving. If you swing your arms over your head, out to your side, allows your trunk to be steady. This requires constant adjustment in the level of activity as movements of the body disturb the body's balance. Here are some key characteristics of skeletal muscle. If you go to the APR module under muscular system, there's also a video on skeletal muscles. Again, don't worry about going into any more detail than what we're covering in this presentation. All right, so skeletal muscles, we said that they look striped, striated, that they're multinucleated. Each muscle cell or fiber has many nuclei. Type of contraction, voluntary. The function of skeletal muscle contraction is movement of your skeleton, and the location is your skeleton. Now, you also have some muscles, for instance, that allow you to move your lips or shut your eyes. They insert on soft tissues, but most often a skeletal muscle goes from bone to bone. This kind of shows you the striations within a skeletal muscle fiber and the large kind of dark purpley stained circular structures are nuclei. There are many skeletal fibers stacked on top of each other in this image. So we mentioned the overlap of the thin and thick filaments, which is kind of a diagram on the right, shows you what it looks like. Very high magnification. Smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is found in your internal organs. Its characteristics: the cells are not as long. They're kind of elongated, but they have tapered ends, pointed ends. Smooth muscle tissue lacks striations, and it has a relatively underdeveloped sarcoplasmic reticulum. The type of contraction by smooth muscle tissue is involuntary. Smooth muscles are found in your visceral or internal organs. Good examples: the digestive system, where peristalsis enables the rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscle that pushes food through your digestive system. It allows for vasoconstriction, VC, vasodilation, VD, of your blood vessels. This helps to regulate blood flow and blood pressure. So if you look at this smooth muscle, the top of the image, they're showing some longitudinal fibers, but if you look toward the bottom, you can see, right, muscle fibers stacked on top of each other, but they don't have the same striations as we saw with the skeletal muscle fibers. Ooh, high magnification, smooth muscle. There are two categories of smooth muscle tissue. There's multi-unit smooth muscle. This is found in your blood vessels, the iris of your eye, which controls the size of your pupil. And here, the smooth muscle fibers contract separately rather than as sheets. In the muscles found in your digestive system, the cells are stacked up together. They're found in sheets, and the stimulation of one fiber can then cause the stimulation of an adjacent fiber. And so these fibers can display rhythmicity. This allows for peristalsis, alternating contraction of smooth muscle fibers that allow for movement of food through the digestive system. Smooth muscle contraction is similar to skeletal muscle contraction. It's the same myosin binding to actin mechanism. However, both acetylcholine and norepinephrine act as neurotransmitters to stimulate contraction. In smooth muscle, hormones can also stimulate or inhibit contraction. This helps to regulate the motility of the smooth muscle in the digestive tract. Smooth muscle is slower to contract and relax than skeletal muscle. It also doesn't generate as much power or force. However, it's therefore fatigue resistant. It can contract longer using the same amount of ATP or energy. Your skeletal muscles, specifically your large skeletal muscles, kind of are the real energy hogs of your body. They require an awful amount of ATP to contract. Cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is striated, right, similar to skeletal. There is only one nuclei in each cell, so it's uninucleated. The ends of cardiac muscle cells are branched, and one cardiac muscle cell will attach to the next by a specialized structure called intercalated disc. We'll discuss that more in detail in a minute. The type of contraction is involuntary. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart, where it functions to pump blood. Intercalated discs are a complex membrane junction that joins cells together. It's able to transmit the force of contraction from one cell to the next. This aids in the rapid transmission of impulses throughout the heart, allows the chambers of the heart to contract in unison. Cardiac muscle cell is self-exciting and rhythmic. And again, the chambers of the heart contract together as a unit. Yes, a heart can beat outside the body. I'll put a link for this video below. But just like the bodily functions that occur after death, sometimes this is pulled down due to content. It's just a heart beating. Come on. So you can see the intercalated discs. They just look like little lines or seams that are connecting a branch of one cardiac muscle cell to another. That is the end of the muscular system. I know we haven't done any word parts, prefixes or suffixes or word roots in the last 2 chapters, but don't worry, we'll be getting back to them shortly.